This is class number 6 of RPH 140, World Philosophies, that has been upgraded to be Practical Wisdom in Our Time. So let me review what we've been doing so far, and then I will explain what we're doing today. So far, I have the first class was about the reading list, and I explained why I assigned what I assigned. The main issue there was that the evidence that students who are first and second generation college students who go to liberal arts colleges, like the ones that I've attended and taught at my whole life, tend to go out after graduation and live very flourishing lives in Aristotle's definition. They take on leadership positions in their communities. They engage in cultural activities. They read, and they basically become informed and contribute to the democracy. So the idea here is that liberal arts institutions were founded by our founding fathers and others since then. And they were often, usually founded by people in the name of a certain religious denomination. The point was to unite reason and faith and to develop a sense of human flourishing that could be supported at church, but could not be. But the idea was when you're a citizen, you have to have an idea of the good, an idea of political life that is based on our humanity. That's why I use Aristotle's ethics, his model of virtue, because it can be attached to any religious tradition or it can be separated and be a secular kind of humanism. The second lecture was about how Mr. Dershowitz talks about what is college for. He says that you're supposed to question everything you were ever taught and decide if you think it follows reason. And if you have to put it on a foundation of humanistic values. Aristotle's virtues are just the example I use. It's not the only one. But Aristotle's virtues are consistent with any other model that somebody would come up with. Then I talk about how Athens had a great democracy. It was structured to encourage people to think like citizens, and they corrupted it and they lost it. Then I have a little outline about the myth of normal, that the main point there is that our culture at the moment, American culture, and this is a very recent book, is toxic. And it's a feature of the culture that if you are acculturated, you will get physically and mentally sick. It's a setup. And so you have to, my students have to reconsider what they consider normal and their behavior. Then I want to give them the really big picture. We live in the 7th age of globalization, the 4th industrial revolution. It is going to be it's a very disrupting time. It's the digital disruption, the technological disruption, geopolitical disruption, environmental disruption, and demographic disruption with people moving into cities. All right, so this is the big picture. Don't be afraid. Don't be surprised. You have to lead. My students should lead. They can't lead unless they know. They anticipate these disruptions and they have resilience. They're not going to overreact. Next reading is about how globalization in this 4th era, but especially early on, was mismanaged so that people in developing countries, the only people who benefited were middle class in India and China. People moved into the middle class and the rich in America. But the system was structured so that selfish, wealthy Americans got to decide the rules for the International Monetary Fund because America contributed the most to the fund. And whoever contributed the most got to make the rules or veto anything they didn't want. So it was designed for the wealthy to benefit, and they really structured it so that only they benefited. The developing countries were asked to change their agricultural system to allow their natural resources to be exploited indefinitely without renewable policies, and also their people to be exploited. They cut working protections for workers, environmental protections were all cut, minimal government intervention, pro-capitalist free market. And even in the US, the workers suffered because their jobs went to developing countries that offshored them. And within the country, because of the threat of sending jobs abroad, workers had to concede a lot and have a lot worse salaries, pensions, conditions of work. And again, our environment got exploited. The next lecture is about the economic collapse. And Mr. Sachs says, it goes both ways. Yes, the wealthy, again, extending the globalization, the same minimal government intervention, just a free market, was applied within the US. And the US has a much worse system than the social democracies of Northern Europe. We did not have to shrink our middle class. We did not have to deny people good education and healthcare and transportation. That was a choice. So on the one hand, our elites betrayed us, but on the other hand, the public allowed itself to be distracted and manipulated. So Mr. Sachs, is saying, yes, you can complain all you want. It's just that you can have agency. In the US, you can find out what went on and you can do something about it. That is what I want my students to know. And this is not Republican or Democrat. This is not progressive or conservative. It isn't. It's much more big picture. It's much more about how do you want to lead? How do my students want to lead into the next generation so that they can have a decent life and their children can have a decent life because of the threats, environmental threats in particular, but also keeping up with the high-tech economy. We need to educate our people. There's just lots of things that are really common sense that they aren't partisan at all. They're not even political. They're just, if you want your society to flourish on the Aristotelian model, this is common sense. So the next reading for today is about as the economic decline continues, as the middle class shrinks, and this has happened all over the world, the democracies are being undermined. And so I have 3 books. Again, during COVID, I decided to read as many books as I could every weekend. I read about 300 pages to try and understand what has been going on since 1980 and then what's going on now. And yeah, these books were written in 2017, 2018, and 2019. And then I also, during COVID, a lot of people were stuck at home and they wrote good books. They wrote the books that they were too busy to write before COVID. So that's one thing about COVID. Whatever else, I know that I didn't handle it the way most people do, but it did work out. There were just lots of really good books coming out. So here's the first point, that in a book, Democracies Divided, it's put out by the Brookings Institute. which is a think tank. And uh, I don't like everything they do, but I like this one because I do think it's big picture. It's trying to get a bigger picture of what's going on. Um, the So I will talk about this. They talk about polarization, the global challenge of political polarization, and they have 7 case studies. So I have quotes from the introduction, which gives sort of the general picture, but they have the their examples, their case studies, severe polarization and democratic breakdown were in Turkey and Kenya. The severe polarization and democratic stress were in the United Nations, India, and Poland. Elite polarization in relatively homogeneous societies was Colombia and Bangladesh. And then staying clear, question mark. The ones that seemed to be hanging together were Indonesia and Brazil. But of course, this is 2025 and things have changed. Things are changing so fast. But I do think you need to have a little bit of perspective, right? I mean, I'm going back to Aristotle, and these writers, uh, 2 of them today, do go back to the Greeks and what the Greeks were trying to warn us about, both Plato and Aristotle. They know the literature, and that's what I want my students to know, that you're part of a conversation, that uh, people who are part of this conversation are really supposed to be the leaders, the enlightened leaders. Um, so the other thing that really annoys me about these books is that the scholars are at fancy places, Harvard and Yale and all that. And I'm teaching in rural Arkansas, and I'm watching all of this happen. Like rural Arkansas switched more, my county switched more from Democrat to Republican than any other county in the country in 2004. And when these pundits come along and say, gee, how did this happen? I was like, you should get out of your office and go live somewhere else or find out what's going on. So even though these pundits or these fancy schmancy people with the big status don't think of themselves as polarizing, they have this wonderful rational point of view, they're isolated. They don't understand the spirit of the times. They weren't aware of how serious the workers' situation was, or they didn't understand the kind of emotional response and the kind of rhetorical response, like what was going on. I knew because my students used to talk to me about it. Because when they write their papers, they have to come and talk to me 4 times every semester about their thesis statements, and I have them write on things like Confucianism, Buddhism, and religious tolerance and all these things. So I knew what was going on, and I really wish America had the system Indonesia has, which is that every single professor has to be involved in a community engagement project. And then at least part of their scholarship is directly linked to the community. Then they can publish in their journals and their publishers, and they'll get status, university press. Every single professor has to get out of their silo and their jargon and talk to people. But I don't run the world, and so we have to look at what the authorities have said. At the end of the 20th century, many political observers assumed The coming decades would be a time of democratic triumph, with a remarkable democratic wave of the 80s and 90s coming to full fruition. Instead, democratic stagnation and setbacks have marked the first 2 decades of this century to such an extent that today, talk of a global democratic crisis is widespread. Actually, we're past that. New and old democracies alive are confronting a daunting array of internal and external challenges, from the crumbling of public support for long-established political parties and the swelling of popularity of illiberal politicians to the growing assertiveness of authoritarian powers and ideas across borders. Recent developments in democracies around the world make clear that political polarization manifested in increasingly harsh divides between opposing political camps and diminishing shared political ground is a crucial part of this troubling picture. Yeah, but that has been going on for a long time, and many of those pundits are actually doing some research on American history and finding out, ooh, I guess I grew up in a bubble. Yeah, I think so. Polarization weakens respect for democratic norms, corrodes basic legislative processes, undermines the nonpartisan stature of the judiciary, fuels public disaffection with political parties. It exacerbates intolerance and discrimination, diminishes social trust, and increases violence throughout the society. So he cites a number of different countries, and probably the list is longer at this point. I know in the US, we just re-elected Trump, and he's much more aggressive. Right in the first couple weeks, he's done a lot more than he did in the first weeks of his first 4 years. There is a difference between healthy polarization and toxic polarization. There's an elite polarization where it's just the elite parties that are fighting it out, whereas the people aren't that engaged, involved. And then there's severe, where everybody's social identity, all the way down to everybody in the country's identity, is caught up with being one political party or another. So when it's severe, it fuses elite polarization and mass polarization, creates large opposing blocks that comprise both elites and non-elites. And it's very emotional. People differ and they're very emotionally engaged. They dislike people on the other side. They can't coexist with them. They don't want their children marrying. So that's a problem. Like, you can't have a free society. So here are the questions that they asked in relation to each country. What are the roots of the polarization? When did it emerge and why? What are the disagreements? How has it changed over time? What factors have influenced it? Is it just the elite or the masses? What are the political and societal effects? How is it affecting the functioning of the political system? And what social tensions is it creating? What can you do to remedy? That's important. So I think my students can be part of the remedy. I mean, all the data says they are. They can step up and do it, even if they don't have as much status as the elites. They're in a much better, for that reason, they're in a better position to reduce polarization. So they have the worst, the severe, the not severe, but there's conflict, could get worse. Bangladesh has had big problems since then, and the ones that have avoided it. So polarization roots itself in multiple types of social identities, some of them religion, ethnicity, and ideology. So that's another main issue in my teaching career was to use Aristotle to show how the life stories and the ways of life of Jesus, Buddha, Mohammed, Socrates, and Confucius and others really have very similar way of life. And it's a way of life that my students or anyone can imitate and aspire to have. And we can, that should be our goal. To whatever tradition you grew up with, if you look at the humanistic branch of it, you definitely can overcome this polarization. It shouldn't be a problem. So I think the big problem is the lack of education or the wrong kind of education. The educational system we have is not helping with this, and it could help with this. So that's sort of my sense of calling, is to link current trends in the science of systems thinking with the United Nations, with different religious traditions, with secular humanism, and Aristotle's virtues are the backbone, but we need a new, improved, modified virtue ethic. And that is a foundation from which we can work. So chapter 3 was about the US. And I have included in a lot of notes, but I'm not going to go over them because I do have the notes from um, the general notes that are true of every society. And I chose the quotes from the US that really fit with these more general, the conclusions, the comparative experiences and insights. So somebody looking at this outline would see that, oh, all right, the US is just one example. But it's happening everywhere. And so again, I can teach my material anywhere. I have taught it in different places. I've taught it to students from lots of different countries, and they all understand. Um, so there is this problem with it's not just a point of view, it's your entire identity. And that religion really, unfortunately, religion is being used as a weapon, as a part of the polarization, the problem, when actually any college undergraduate at a liberal arts college that understands the point of liberal arts is to pull yourself away from your conditioning, from your propaganda, and find a new foundation for what your worldview, formulate your own idea of the good based on reason, a common humanity, and then you can move forward. So my goal would be to tell a student that your identity shouldn't be caught up in anything that should be polarizing because it's not honest. We all have the same basic humanity. So your religious or ethnic or tribal identity, all these those are the kind of separations that my classes, my career has tried to point out are really not legitimate, right? They're not the substance of the teachings and the way of life of the icons of these traditions. Um, ethnic or tribal identities, Europe is caught up with this. Again, the Europeans are secular humanists. Now, the difference between modern humanism and ancient spiritual humanism, Aristotelian humanism, is fundamental. And modern humanism was based on a view of science and social science, which neuroscientists have now rejected. And the most recent studies in neuroscience have, I think I wrote a book about it, confirmed the view of Aristotle rather than the dualism of Kant or the reductionism of the utilitarians. So again, we can adapt Aristotle's psychology to our time. Aristotle is very sexist for one thing, but we can use it. It's a correspondence theory of the psyche and how to educate people's emotions so that they can become wise. The purpose of the arts is to educate our emotions. And so the arts were trivialized in the modern era. There's just a lot of issues with the difference between ancient and modern. And then, but you, of course, you have to adopt the ancient views to the current times. You have to be able to integrate them with the science and social science that we have. But the modern foundations for science and social science have been overthrown, and yet our educational systems, I think, still are based on them, unfortunately. So all of these issues are based, I think, I would argue, on certain modernist and postmodern points of view that have really not have been refuted. But so that's why so many of the intellectuals are part of the problem. Either they hide away in their silos with their jargon, or they literally do polarizing things. And again, I would like to call out, the intellectuals and rally them around doing what they can to engage with the public in a way that really would overcome this. Okay, so polarizing actors and programs. He gives examples of some of the people. Okay, and then there's what should the opposition do? Should they just do the same thing and get into this huge polarized, even more polarization? Or should they compromise or adapt? It's really hard to know. And those are judgment calls and they change all the time. So this can emerge quickly. That's why I say, I mean, it's 2025 now, and the book was published in 2019, which means the data was a few years older than that. But it is good to get a little bit of a trajectory here. Additional drivers are the political systems. Some of them are more geared toward polarization than others. Okay, some of the other thing is the informal institutions, patronage. Indonesia functioned on that. It could lead to corruption, but it also could lead, and the citizens just reject the system, or it could, if the ruler provides jobs and infrastructure to people on both sides of the divide, you can sort of calm things down. So then again, it's a judgment call. It changes all the time. But what about guardrail institutions, the informal but critical norms? And that is what Mr. Trump, the first time, many professionals would talk about, well, this was a norm. It was considered a norm to accept the results of an election and not to claim that it was false, right? The 2020 election. But there were many other norms that Mr. Trump has broken, and we shall see what happens. Again, at the moment, it's looking worse than ever, but for my students, I just say, it'll change, and you can change it. And I'd like to be part of the change. What about the judicial institutions? How do you prevent, them from becoming corrupt? What about an administration? Prevent political actors from bending the rules. This is an issue in the US, and I assume everywhere else. Everything is an issue in the US, I think, at this point, but it can end, it can turn around pretty easily. Changes in the media, that's another big issue. And it's happening. This is the point of this, is it's happening everywhere. So the economic issues, sometimes it gets worse when the economies improve, but sometimes it's the distribution of wealth that makes it worse. It's because the money isn't being distributed. And then the consequences. Okay, the judiciary could get corrupted. It weakens the lawmaking process by reducing cooperation and leading. In the US, we have a terrible problem with gridlock. Is the president acting for everyone, but only his loyalists? What about the political parties? Have they lost credibility, and is it legitimate, right? Have they lost it for good reason? What about foreign policies? What about, I think, the problem with political branding, that politicians know how to create a political brand. So maybe there's 15 issues that are part of one of the brands. Well, so if you pick one or two and say, you really agree with that? That's horrible. Well, it's the brand. And, if there's 15 major issues that a person really cares about, and their brand is correct on 9 of those, the other 6 could be outrageous, but they'd still stick to it. And in a way, the political parties have set it up that way. They have these wedge issues, and it's hard. So on the one hand, the public will vote for horrible things because it's not their brand, would be a bad reason. But on the other hand, the politicians have set the public up so that they absolutely can't vote for anything they really care about without the party also doing things they really find horrible. So I think that might be why a lot of people just don't vote. There's lots of reasons why they wouldn't vote, but this branding is really a serious problem. There's a decline in civility, but I myself, because of my position and because I think it's so important, I don't engage in uncivil. I've been in a lot of situations and not spoken out. I'm not necessarily proud of it, but in general, if I can't think of some way where speaking up would actually help, if all I know is it would trigger a counter reaction, I don't do it. Because I live in a small town, I represent the college, and it's very important to me that the people in the town think highly of the college, and their experience with me would lead them to confirm, oh, she's a really nice person, and she teaches at Lyon, and she believes in Lyon, which I do, and I believe in liberal arts. I'm so proud of the Honor Council and the Social Council. I give lectures to social groups in my town to tell them why Lyon is so wonderful, and they should come over and come to concerts and theater and music and sports. It's a nice resource for them. So I try to be civil, but I have been isolated quite a bit, because I do try to get involved internationally, because the things I care about are international, and I think, as far as I can tell, I can make more of a contribution if I connect with people internationally. All right, so the overall, okay, so we have political systems. The worst is a civil war, military invention, illiberal one-party dominance, and majoritarian drift. illiberal ideas gain acceptance because they can't get elected without rejecting pluralism. The democratic dysfunction is another category, and that's the US. Severe polarization doesn't necessarily lead to democratic erosion, but you don't know. So, and again, I think that the situation right now is more serious than it was then. They were writing, well, Trump had been president for a couple years. So, we'll see what happens. What are the remedies? Tribal behavior is hard to overcome. So a lot of my work, I've worked in Indonesia where they have religious pluralism and humanitarianism is right in their political ideology. And I thought, wow, I can work with these people. And so I do. And I've taught at Islamic State universities where the teachers there really are committed to religious pluralism. They just did not understand that Aristotle can be used as a major foundation for their religious pluralism, and it's right in their constitution that it's humanism. And I say, this is the kind of humanism that really works. So I have published quite a bit, and I've been over there quite a bit. But I would like to also try other countries. I can't go there anymore because the weather and the pollution and the dengue fever. There's just things I can't do anymore. So I will do what I can. But that's what I'm highly motivated to show people. There's no real need for polarization based on ethnicity or a lot of other or religious identity. Okay, in many polarized countries, religious organizations, universities have launched initiatives to foster dialogue, right? That's what I'm part of, and that's what I want to keep working on. Teaching tolerance through civic education. And the way I do it isn't anti-religion. It's not, I think in some people's minds, this is secular only, but it's not. I can build a bridge. All right. Yeah, it's hard to reform the political parties. Political action media reform, of course, is a huge issue. Okay, so develop local capacities, right? Help researchers inform political and public debates. I do think there could be a revival of small towns in the US that have been gutted out by globalization, and just to have community centers, to have a whole lot of community activities where people can come, they can take dance lessons and perform music, the arts, theater, but also tutoring, tutorial sessions. There's just lots of things. And as older people in the rural areas, as people get older, it'd be much wiser for them to move in, to have some housing, apartments, or housing for older people right in the town where they can have access to all of these wonderful activities. And physiologically, it's much better for their brains and their mental and physical health if they're constantly active. And so, and then if you could do research on, okay, what's going on here? Do people want this? Does it sound like a good thing? I mean, you have to do research to think, is this going to be feasible? Would you come and move here? And then keep track of ideas that work, how to revive those towns as a high quality of life, really quality of life. And you would prevent a lot of illnesses too. It's just kind of sad that we've gotten to the point where so much of our culture is lead. It's so toxic, as Mr. Gabor says. All right, so there's all these problems that don't seem to be going away anytime soon. The problem is the people who benefit the most from the income inequalities throughout the world and also the polarization, they benefit the most and they bear the least cost, right? So I do think ordinary citizens need to step up and recognize what's going on, and they can save their democracy. So it's very ironic that the people who inherit democracies seem to be dedicated to destroying them, whereas people who might not be associated with having the strictest commitment to democracy are exactly those people who are going to save it. And I do believe that it's perfectly reasonable to think that, and it might even be our only hope, are people in rural communities or first generation that will take care of it for us. All right, so here's a couple more excerpts, which I think, again, are really important. It's important to get a sense that scholars who study these things, professionals, even though they unfortunately were blindsided and did not anticipate this, have come back and they're starting to get it. So Mr. Tim Snyder at Yale, he gives us 20 things to do, which I will talk about at the end. But the quotes here, I think are very interesting. So history does not repeat, but it does instruct. Again, that's my whole thing with the Greeks and throughout my career with China, with Confucius and all these things. I'm always looking for patterns, similar and different. So that's education by analogy. And I think that is the real substance of humanities education. Poetry, right? I mean, the purpose of poetry is to communicate with another person about emotions. And so you realize, geez, we have the same emotions. This person lived 2,500 years ago or on the other side of the world. I thought I didn't have anything in common with them. And all of a sudden, wow. I mean, poetry, essays, literature, history, philosophy, theology, the icons of these, all of these things. And it's just, the Greeks have 9 muses, and the muses are the artists. And they are, the poet's gift is to be able to recognize patterns in the way we feel and the way we act and the choices we make, the history we create, and we can educate each other and ourselves. Once we recognize those patterns, we can say, don't do this, do this, and here's why. So, okay, history doesn't repeat, but it instructs. As the founding fathers debated our Constitution, they took instruction from the history they knew. Concerned that the democratic republic they envisioned would collapse, they contemplated the descent of ancient democracies and republics into oligarchy and empire. As they knew, Aristotle warned that inequality brought instability, while Plato believed that demagogues exploited free speech to install themselves as tyrants. All right, that's what I've talked about in the past. The art of statecraft for Aristotle is the art of weaving together the rich and poor to make a middle class. He's very insistent on that. You have to have a strong inheritance tax, so you don't have a class of people inheriting money and separating themselves from the rest of the society. Plato was talking, Plato described how democracies decline into tyrannies. In founding a democratic republic upon law and establishing a system of checks and balances, the founding fathers sought to avoid the evil that they, like the ancient philosophers, called tyranny. Right, okay. So here's the way I put the class together, the pieces. I've picked readings that actually connect to each other, because it is hard. It's hard to see all the connections, but they're there. And okay. So I will point out another very important thing. It's an analogy. Um, okay. History can familiarize, it can warn. In the late 19th century, just as in the late 20th century, the expansions of global trade generated expectations of progress. In the early 20th century, as in the early 21st, these hopes were challenged by new visions of mass politics, in which a leader or a party claimed to directly represent the will of the people. Okay, I mean, everything, oh my goodness, everything he says is still very relevant, but I can't read all of it. Oh, both fascism and communism were responses to globalization, to the real and perceived inequalities it created, and the apparent helplessness of the democracies in addressing them. This was also something that Jeffrey Sachs talks about in his Ages of Globalization. But I did want to get more authors than just him involved in this project in my class, so that the students understand that since where are we? Hmm, okay. Oh yeah, okay, this is the last quote. I don't publish things on Facebook or anything. But he says, since in the age of the internet, we are all publishers, each of us bears some private responsibility for the public sense of truth. If we're serious about seeking the facts, we can each make a small revolution in the way the internet works. If you're verifying information for yourself, you will not send on fake news to others. To me, it's just so much more important to see the big picture than to send on something about the latest thing. It's just, it doesn't, your brain is working in a different sphere if you're just competing about how to interpret the latest news. And it's just gonna, it's it's so much more important to see the big picture, I think. Um, to see that, yeah, this is the next stage of globalization. And I talk to my students and I keep reminding them of that, because they shouldn't sell out to anything. They should really read books. Yeah, okay. So here's another book, How Democracies Die. And they say that we've spent our whole careers studying how democracies decline into tyrannies. But they say they never thought it was going to happen here, which is kind of annoying. But now we find ourselves turning to our own country. We feel dread, as do many Americans, even as we try to reassure ourselves that things can't really be that bad here. Oh gosh, so when I read that, I thought, you really need to get out and go to other parts of the country and read a little bit more about our history and things. Come on, you guys. Yet we worry American politicians treat their rivals as enemies to intimidate the free press. threaten to reject the results of elections. They try to weaken the institutional buffers of our democracy, including the courts, the intelligence services, and the ethics offices. All right. So, um, they're worried. I'm worried. We all should be worried. My students should be. Then they say there's one way that democracies die, and that's with a coup and guns and, happens overnight. But there's another way to break a democracy, and democracies may die at the hands not of generals, but of elected leaders who subvert the very processes that brought them to power. And this happens, democracies in this way erode slowly. And that's what they've been studying. So they've seen it happen in other places many times, but they did not think it could happen in the US. And they talk about Cesar Chavez in Venezuela. And let me see. They have a lot of other examples. Many governments' efforts to subvert democracy are legal in the sense that they're approved by the legislature or accepted by the courts. They may be even portrayed as efforts to improve the democracy, making the judiciary more efficient, combating corruption, or cleaning up the electoral process. I mean, yes, the reason why I'm reading this is, yes, we're in the midst of all of this, and my students can start, most of them they aren't that aware of things, and there are issues that I will defend my students on. They have a lot of pressures on them. So my students, first and second generation, they are in sports, 85% in sports. Why? Because the cost of these institutions has gone up way faster than their parents' salaries have gone up. And so they get into a sport to get a scholarship, which is understandable. It's just that then their time is so limited to read and to reflect, right? It's not just reading, it's really thinking about what you're reading, taking time to write a paper, coming in to talk to me about their ideas, other than just to, do the outline and talk to me and go home and write it and check it off the check sheet. I even have students that have quit sports because they really want to spend more time on school. But I don't blame them. They're caught. They're caught in a system that the grown-ups set up for them that's destroying the natural environment. It's undermining democracy. It's making life harder for their parents to pay for their education. And so they have to do these things. I just think, and then their sexuality is exploited, their concern for social status is exploited, their attention is exploited, all of their vulnerable emotions are exploited for money. So I don't uh, hold anything against my students, but I do tell them, doesn't matter, you still have agency. So you still have to do it, whether or not it's fair that you have to, but you do have to save the democracy. Let's see what else I might pick to read from in this section. All right. Okay, so they actually did a study of similarities between all of these types of leaders so that we could have a kind of list of what to look for, and how to know if our countries are being taken over by more authoritarians. So we should worry, he says, we should worry when a politician rejects in words and actions the democratic rules of the game, denies the legitimacy of opponents, etc. So let's just look at their list. So they have the rejection, 4 indicators of authoritarian behavior. The rejection or weakening to democratic rules of the game. And here's the questions. Do they reject the Constitution or express a willingness to violate it? Do they suggest a need for undemocratic measures? Okay, such as canceling elections, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a really good list. I think people in the class, of course, have the reading, and people who are just informally taking the class, it's right there. You probably don't need to read it for you. So there's the way they deal with the system when they're elected. Do they deny the legitimacy of their political opponents? Do they describe their rivals as subversive or opposed to the existing order, right? They're going to claim that they're the representatives of the order, or that somehow we don't need this order anymore, and try to convince people. Do they basically suggest their rivals are foreign agents or criminals or something like that? And then the third one is toleration or encouragement of violence. All right. Another important indicator. Do they have ties to armed gangs, paramilitary forces, militias, guerrillas, or other organizations that engage in violence? Have they encouraged mob attacks on opponents? Have they tacitly endorsed violence in various ways? Okay, have they praised or refused to condemn acts of political violence? All right. And then the last one, readiness to curtail civil liberties of opponents, including the media. Have they supported policies that restrict civil liberties, libel or defamation laws? Do they expand those? Have they threatened to take legal or other action against critics, or against the media? Have they praised repressive measures taken by other governments? So, I myself have read enough about what's going on, but I think my students, the main thing is keep the questions in mind, right? And okay, the writers recommend what people can do, how the political parties can isolate these types of leaders and prevent them from taking over. Yeah, and they look at the history of gatekeeping, the pros and cons to it. All right, let's see. I'm gonna go past that and let the students, let the people who read it and think about it. So again, this is these are analogies. This is education by analogy, which is a very old-fashioned kind of way to educate. My big thing is that in the modern, literally modern and postmodern world, the theoretical backdrop, the view that the psyche is a blank slate and that people in the Enlightenment really thought that they were going to change human history forever. And there are recent neuroscientists, highly respectable neuroscientists, who created the opioid drugs. He said he really did think he was going to change the human playing field forever and get rid of pain, addiction, violence, and depression. And of course, he hasn't. There's just been 30,000+ people are dying from opioid overdoses. And so that blindness is incredible. that they didn't think these really primitive drives that we have, pleasure and fear, fantasies and phobias, are never going away. Every time a child is born, we have those primitive drives. So that's why you can make analogies. And these events are triggered by fear, right? Globalization. People are afraid of the future. They're trying to survive, survival instinct. And the leader appeals to pleasure and also to fantasy, right? If you vote for me and you fantasize about this leader and he's cool and he's, physically beautiful, or he sells you something that appeals to your fantasies and your phobias. And that's why we can have analogies. All right, what else? Hmm. Comparing our current predicament to democratic crises in other parts of the world and at other moments of history, it becomes clear that America is not so different from other nations. Our constitutional system, while older and more robust, is vulnerable to the same pathologies that have killed democracy elsewhere. Ultimately, then, American democracy depends on us, the citizens of the US. No single political leader can end a democracy. No single leader can rescue us either. Democracy is a shared enterprise. Its fate depends on all of us. And that's really what I believe. And I believe in my students to be able to do. I think they can. But, you know, it's not a given. All right. So that is the egalitarianism, civility, sense of freedom, and shared purpose, portrayed by E.B. White, were the essence of mid-20th century American democracy. Today, that vision is under assault, not only in the US, but across the industrialized West. Few societies in history have managed to be both multiracial and truly democratic. But I think we have every reason to think that we can be one of those few. Also, if you're not American and you're listening to this, uh, I think it's important for you to know that America is not special and that your countries have to tap into what's great about what aspects of their country are really more amenable to developing and preserving democracy. And that's why when I work with Indonesia, I tell them, well, your political philosophy, because it starts out with a belief in God, a modern person would say, well, you can't have a democracy like that. But if they have a culture that's committed to it, and the founding fathers wrote that because they knew that people wouldn't accept any constitution that didn't allow for their religious identities, but they also have humanitarianism. So they can link pluralism, religious pluralism, with humanitarianism. And so they have things like university community engagement projects. They have an intellectual elite that's absolutely committed to making it work. So I don't ever rule out the different ways people can get to a free and open society. But I do think some Aristotle or some other kind of spiritual humanism, we have to understand our common humanity. Now, Mr. Snyder gives us some advice, and his book is a little book. It's not very expensive. It's just kind of a guidebook for how to save your democracy. And some of them are, I identify with some of them more than others, but I think it's really a good list to keep in mind do not obey in advance would be, it's had to be pretty far gone, I think. Defend institutions. Okay, this is me. I'm absolutely, completely committed to liberal arts education. This is what I've dedicated my life to. And I do think it is really important. I taught at a liberal arts school in Bangladesh. I would love to teach at more small liberal arts colleges. I think they really are designed to educate people for citizenship. So I certainly hope this class comes across as being organized and taught by somebody who really wants us to save our democracy. Um, take responsibility for the world. Remember professional ethics. As I said, I get disappointed in my profession. There was an article by a philosopher who said she goes on these blog posts from other professional philosophers, and the name of the article is Philosophy as Blood Sport. People are just AK-47, using their brains like machine guns. And they do that. I've been at conferences and I just am appalled, and I just don't function that way. I want dialogue, and I've been beaten down, and I've never done that to anybody. When I've written some reviews and things, and I've had the editor of the journal write me back and say, wow, that was an incredibly fair review. That was a really good one, because you didn't necessarily agree, but you were completely fair. That's so important to me. I mean, just as a person, oh, I've had some book reviews that are so outrageous. I can't. It blows my mind. And I really worry about professional ethics. The American Philosophical Association in 2000, and then again in 2010, came out saying we have to get out there. We have to get out there into the public realm. But, you don't go out there and say, okay, you dummies, I know this and you don't. So would you please listen to me? I don't do that. You start out the way Socrates did. He asks people, what do they think? And then and most of the people he talks to are those elites, because they're the ones that really have crashed everything. I don't blame the masses. I think the average person is perfectly capable of figuring out when they're getting manipulated, but not if they're given a terrible K through 12 education and they're bombarded with billions and billions of dollars worth of advertisements and stealing your attention and exploiting your brainstem, your pleasures and fears. I still think ultimately the elites are the problem, but I do think you can convince less educated people to come together in community centers, to get along and to create a community and to save our democracy. I really do believe that. But I do not know. I know it's possible, and I know it's the way to flourish. I do not know if that will happen, if it can be cultivated and sustained. Okay, take responsibility for what's going on. Of course, be wary of paramilitaries. Be reflective if you must be armed. Stand out. Be kind to our language. That's what destroyed Athens, was when the sophists taught the elite how to manipulate people in the assembly and the juries. And then they could wrap the city around their finger and do whatever they wanted. Believe in truth. There is truth. We do have a common humanity. For good or evil, I mean, Greek tragedy tells you could stab your husband to death. Clytemnestra had her reasons. And, if you put yourself in her shoes, you could say, geez, I might have done that myself. Or everything that people in those tragedies do that you think are so appalling. The whole point of the tragedy is if you get engaged and you follow what's going on, you would realize you have a capacity for brutality. And so you ought to do everything you can to create a society where people are not driven to desperation, so they would react in these horrible ways. That's the point. So when I say truth, it is true that we're made to flourish, but it's also true that we're very capable of brutality. So have a complicated view of truth, but there definitely is a foundation. There is a human condition. Investigate, don't accept things that aren't researched. Make eye contact. Listen. That's what I do when my students come in. I just focus my mind. That's what my professor did for me. It's why I wanted to do it. He changed my life, and I wanted to do that for for my adult life, to do what meant so much to me. And I realize most students, that's not what they're looking for. But if they are, I'm there. And if they didn't know they cared about it, so a number of them realize, that is helpful. Practice corporeal in your body language and where you put your body. I think nonviolent demonstrations are really important, and I hope there are a lot of them. Whenever there was one in the 60s, you put everything else down and you go get involved, but stay nonviolent. And also, you don't make it into a sex, drugs, and rock and roll party. It's not about that. It's about, in my case in college, it was the massacre of innocent people in my lay. It was about American imperialism. It was about the destruction of the environment. It was about civil rights. They're serious things. You don't party if you're publicly trying to display that you're grieving about these injustices. Learn from peers in other countries. That's why I like to go abroad, contribute to good causes, listen for dangerous words. It's very important. Be calm, be a patriot, and be courageous. So that's, again, with my students. I want them not to be surprised. I want them to lead. And sometimes it takes moral courage. And we do talk about that. Courage, it's a basic virtue in Aristotle. And there is the courage of your convictions. And Muhammad, Socrates, Jesus, all these people, they stood up to the corruption. They paid a price. But patriotic, this is what being an American patriot is. So again, I'm just totally committed to liberal arts. And for me, philosophy is sort of the epitome of a free mind, because my students can come in, they can tell me anything. We'll start anywhere. Like nothing is out of bounds. So I've had students say, I'm a Satanist. Okay, why are you a Satanist? Does it, what do you do when you're Satanist festivals or whatever? Is it making you a better person? It might be, because students who end up there might have had a lot of really horrible experiences, and bonding with other people and flushing out their pain and leaving in a better place, ready to actually live a productive life. Very possible. This particular Satanist did convert to Christianity after a few years, but you know, I don't I don't judge. They were had a Dudist, but I've had a Baha'i, a Mormon, a pagan, neo-pagan, Wiccan. But most of my students are Baptist, actually, and Southern Baptist, and most of them are white, small town. They're not raised to be humanist, but they come and they learn a lot at Lion, or if they want to. And that's patriotic, I I really, to me, I got some of the best things about America were the ones that I was fortunate enough to be dedicated to have the opportunity to do in my career. And I really hope that I can lead the way in trying to save our democracy, but especially my students. I mean, they can do a lot more than I can. And I really wish them well. So that is the lecture. That is lecture number 6. All right.